My husband Bruce worked at Merrill Lynch, and one day he came home and said, John Yon called me, Nancy, and I think he really didn't want to talk to me. I think really he was interested in you. What he wanted was for us to come and have dinner with him at his country place, which he calls the Shire, which is right across from Multnomah Falls, and I'm sure is very beautiful. Well, finally, we agreed on a date, which was August 1st, 1979, and Bruce and I got in our car and drove out to this place on the Washington side, the Shire, right across from Multnomah Falls, and we had this most amazingly elegant, elegant meal and beautiful evening, eating on antique Chinese trays out on the lawn, looking over at Multnomah Falls, the waterfall. There was a full moon, and before the moon came out, the sun just painted the walls of the gorge pink. It was so spectacular. Can't imagine anyone not reacting to all the beauty. Well, what John was really up to was courting me. I had showed a lot of interest in the gorge over the years, led many trips up the gorge, given talks on the gorge, and John had heard about this, and he was focusing for this evening on me, courting me to come out in front and lead a group that could get federal legislation to protect the gorge.
The day after the election, I called Mark Hatfield and said that my candidate for president had lost the election and his candidate for president had won the election. And I was concerned about what was going to happen now with the Columbia River Gorge. How were we going to protect the Columbia River Gorge? Mark Hatfield said that he had championed many natural resource issues and particularly wilderness issues, and had been beaten up on all sides, and that the support for those measures had been pretty thin. And if he was going to do that again, he wanted to have much more support than he'd had in the past. And his support that he wanted was an army of citizens that was broad-based, that was both Republican and Democrat, and that was on both sides of the Columbia River and at both ends of the gorge. One of my staff began to go into the community and identify people who might be the kind of leaders in this army that Mark Hatfield had talked about. And this staff person, Sally Anderson, came back to me and said that there were a number of people in the community, including Nancy Russell.
Without the creation of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge, there never would have been a National Scenic Area Act. And then Nancy really was the visionary behind the act. And you meet a lot of people in the conservation world who have vision. You meet other people who have the ability to implement that vision. You meet others who have the courage of their convictions, the tenacity, the willingness to move forward and attain that vision. But you usually don't get that all in one person, and Nancy had all of that in one person. Many people have forgotten just how controversial the National Scenic Area Act was. When you think about the incredible opposition in Congress to that legislation, a fair amount of grassroots opposition, particularly in the Columbia Gorge. Now, I think many of those people were misled, but there still was a tremendous amount of opposition. And there also was a lot of vilification of Nancy, holding her personally responsible for it.
I was having lunch with a woman named Sis Hayes, and Sis was giving a luncheon, and I can't remember, I don't believe the luncheon had anything to do with the gorge, but at the luncheon were a number of my friends, and they had certainly by this time had heard probably too much about the gorge from me. But that was where I was when Bowen Blair called from Washington, D.C. and said, he called at the luncheon and said that the Gorge Act had passed. And I was numb, really. I didn't have much of a reaction at all, as I recalled. Everyone was clapping and whooping and hollering. And I don't know if I even clapped and hooped and hollering. I remember just being sort of, couldn't believe it had happened.
I'll never forget it. I was in Senator Hatfield's office, and we had been told a few days before to all go home, that there was no hope for the legislation passing. But we decided to stay, and it worked out because mostly Senator Hatfield's miracle working, the legislation did pass. So it was unexpected, which made it even that much more gratifying and emotional. It was an incredible moment.
Looking back over the last 25 years, it's almost more important to look at what hasn't happened rather than what has happened. Proposed subdivisions across from the Vista House in Multnomah Falls, on top of Cape Horn, and near Beacon Rock were never developed. Industrial lands in the western gorge are now in public hands. We know them as the Sandy River Delta and Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge.
The biggest accomplishments in the gorge have been the protection of the gateway, the two gateways, the one on the Oregon side, which was owned by Reynolds Aluminum, and the area of Steigerwald Lake, which isn't a lake, but it was a former wetland protected by dikes that is east of Washougal. This area was proposed for industry. So when you come into the gorge, you leave the clutter of the city behind, and you cross the boundary and you are into the protected Columbia River Gorge, into rural landscape.
The Columbia River Gorge is a National Scenic Treasure. The National Scenic Area Act protects its scenic beauty. But the gorge is also a microcosm of the West, where urban sprawl, mining, and logging could overrun the gorge in a lifetime. That's why Friends of the Columbia Gorge must remain vigilant to be a strong advocate and effective educator to protect the Columbia River Gorge for our children and future generations to enjoy.
For 25 years, Nancy Russell has been the glue that has kept this organization together. Advocate, fundraiser, lobbyist, hike leader. But perhaps her greatest contribution is that she has gone out and personally bought land in the gorge to protect it. Land like this property near the community of Mosher.
What I've always called the South 40 is one of the most important view properties in the gorge. You can't miss it. As you're heading east, you look up and there's this piece of property that's just a little bit to the east of Mosher sticking out there. And so when this came up for sale, I knew it was something that I should be purchasing. I took my husband up there on the way back from Bend and Thanksgiving, and we drove up, opened the gate, drove up to the top, and I said, we turned around and looked at the view, and I told Bruce that I really thought that we should buy this property, and he turned and looked at me and he said, buy it. And I did, and I'm so glad I did. The South 40 was always one of Bruce Russell's favorite properties in the gorge. He liked it so much that he painted the view from the top of the South 40, which hangs in our house at home. Another very important property that I purchased we called the cherry orchard property, and that's because there was a very small, old cherry orchard on the eastern end of the property. A realtor called me and said this property was for sale, and it would have been bought and subdivided, of course. So Bruce and I decided to buy the cherry orchard property, which we did. And over the years, we bought a number of parcels, maybe 5 or 6, that are to the west of the original purchase. So it's possible to hike on this property. When you do a loop, it turns into about a 6-mile loop, which is an excellent distance for hiking. Even though the Cherry Orchard Trail is in private hands, owned by my husband and me for so many years, it's become so popular that some authors have been up there and included it in trail books.
The original effort that Friends of the Columbia River Gorge fostered and that came about was one generation. Now, and the Friends is the continuity. And the Friends of the Columbia River Gorge will continue, and it is now up to new generations to take over those efforts in a tough time and to fight to protect them. And it is a fight. It was a fight to create it, and it's going to be a fight to keep it, but it needs to be done by the new people, the younger people now.
Last year, Friends of the Columbia Gorge received a $4 million bequest from a longtime member and dear friend, Norman Yon. 25 years of effective leadership protecting the gorge and building donor relationships made that happen. Now, as we plan for the future, we're looking forward to putting the final piece in place with the establishment of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge Land Trust program.
It's just astonishing to me how much we have accomplished over the last 25 years. Recently, I went with just one of my children out into the gorge, so I wasn't spending all my time answering questions and talking to people. I was just looking at one property after another where we have been the difference between development and preservation. And so it's extremely important to keep Friends of the Gorge strong and vigorous, for people to continue to give money to the organization, because if our pressure is not there to go down the right path, unfortunately, things can go awry. But as I look to the future, I don't think that will happen. I think there will always be people who love the gorge and who want to preserve it, and will put their time and energy into vigorously defending it in the future.